Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Wilson. I am an Azure architect here at Insight, and I'm going to hand it over to Carm and let him introduce himself real quick.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jason. Welcome, everybody. My name is Carm Taglienti, and I'm a distinguished engineer here at Insight. And part of my portfolio is the modern applications area, and we're looking forward to talking to you about that today. So back to you, Jason.
Thank you. So there's our fancy pictures. Hi. Awesome. So let's talk about the agenda for a moment. So we're going to talk today about what's driving cloud adoption and why that matters to your organization and to you. We're going to define what your cloud strategy is and what success looks like. Then we're going to jump into the phases to a successful app modernization, some common mistakes to avoid, and how Insight and Microsoft can help you on that journey. So there's some key drivers for cloud adoption, and honestly, this particular topic could be very extensive because every organization has different things that are driving their need to drive cloud services. I work with a very diverse set of clients every day, and they have very different needs that are changing how they approach the services that they leverage. Some of the most common ones I hear are, these rapid changes in the marketplace where, what's going on with the competition. And I think, not directly related to our topic today, but obviously we hear about things like AI and how that's impacting the market, or the ability to quickly deliver apps and services to new customer segments, to leverage data, things like that. And those changes in the marketplace are driven by that need to be competitive, right? And so, being able to acquire that competitive edge to get that service out in the marketplace faster, cloud really enables that kind of development. And then the last thing that I wanted to cover in this particular subject is this rising end user expectations, right? So workforces have an expectation for their experience, and when employees enter the workforce, they have this need to be able to communicate effectively and efficiently and to use modern tools. And if as an organization you don't have those things, it's harder for you to acquire the best talent. So there's a lot of really good reasons around cloud adoption. Those are just some of the ones I wanted to highlight today. So what does this really mean from a adoption perspective? What is adoption? And in my worldview, adoption is really about your business strategy, those resources and things that you're going to leverage in that experience, plus cloud success, and cloud success being, how am I defining that? And then having these outcomes like, driving adoption. So when you talk about what each one of those are, so business strategy, like I said, those resources that you're applying, you have to ask a lot of questions about that. Do I have the necessary knowledge, skills, and abilities to be able to drive an effective cloud strategy? And what does that mean? What is the definition of cloud success? So, and this is really in my head, the ability to qualify and quantify with quantitative measures and qualitative measures what my definition of success is. So for example, if I'm building an application on premise today, and that's where all my resources are, I can kind of understand the cost of that based on the cost of the resources that I'm building. But what I can't necessarily gauge is the qualifying expenses around what that costs me from a development perspective for my user experience, right? That having cloud resources that are quickly able to change, that allow me to create new and unique experiences. How do I quantify that in terms of a value chain? So that definition of cloud success becomes really important. And all of those drive that concept around adoption, right? What are the outcomes that I am trying to achieve? And how do I present that back outward into the marketplace? So if my CFO or CTO comes to me and says, hey, we spent money on these cloud resources, what are we getting out of it? Having a good answer to that question is part of that cloud success and helps you drive adoption because you're able to answer those questions up front. So jumping into that, defining business strategies, this is really shaped by the tools, people, and the resources that you're leveraging. So you're asking that critical question of what are you trying to achieve? What is that outcome? And then what resources do you have? So when I speak to clients, oftentimes the answer to these questions is, oh, we're trying to fix, this business problem. But being able to define it, not just in terms of what the business problem is, but also all the tools that you have on the back end to help you get there. Sometimes it's really hard to gather all those resources, especially if you've been tasked with, hey, go acquire this thing, rather than looking at the overall strategy as a whole. So cloud success, this is one of my favorite subjects to talk about, because oftentimes organizations are jumping into the cloud in a place where they just had to do something. My favorite example of this is over the last few years of people adopting remote desktop services, right? Jumping into different clouds to be able to provide desktops for a newly remote workforce. It created a lot of chaos in the marketplace. And so starting off having this business need, they applied resources, but they didn't have a definition of what success looked like around that. And they come back later and they find out, hey, we're not saving money, we're not, optimizing our workloads, we're not doing these things, because there wasn't a plan around what that success looked like, right? What that definition was. So it's really important. And one of the things Insight does all the time, and I do this every day, is help organizations understand what that success could look like. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Carm.
Great. Thanks so much, Jason. So one of the things that Jason was talking about, and he sort of set the stage for this, was really this idea of cloud adoption. And cloud adoption, to the points that Jason was making, really is around what are the benefits that the cloud can provide for you as you think about taking advantage of the managed services capabilities or the IaaS capabilities that are provided within the cloud environment. So it can actually simplify your environment quite a bit. But more specifically, I wanted to talk a little bit about the application infrastructure. And so it's really important to understand that as we think about taking advantage of our cloud infrastructure or the platform infrastructure within the cloud, we also want to think about our applications. So the applications that can help us to understand, are we getting value out of those applications? So if we look at sort of current state of enterprise apps, we can see that really 45% of the applications, based on studies that we've done, shows that, there aren't all those applications, or they're not used frequently or regularly. And so that's an important consideration as you think about, well, what do we do with them? So are we paying for infrastructure, or is the financial operations side of what we're doing, does it make sense to continue to manage and maintain them? Maybe do we retire them? So there's a category of, and I'll talk about this in just a few minutes, but how do we understand what we have in our inventory of applications, and then what do we want to do with them over time? And certainly cloud adoption helps to sort of set the stage for making decisions about our application estate. So we'll think about that as we move forward. The other thing that's important is that legacy systems, and this kind of aligns to the concept of technical debt, is that 15% budget increases every year for maintenance. So we have to take care of them. We have to update them. We have to do something with respect to those applications. And if you even consider on top of it, half of the applications, or 45%, are not used regularly. So now all of a sudden we're saying, I'm not only am I having to manage and maintain them, but I'm paying for the infrastructure that's associated with it. So those budget increases are very real in terms of the financial operations of your application estate in the cloud, or even not in the cloud. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the cloud, but in general, you still have to take care of those applications regardless. And then the last one that's important to talk about is 87% of executives agree that they need to modernize critical applications so that they can maintain, as Jason was talking about before, competitive advantage, or the ability to innovate to make sure that they can keep up with their competitors, or even to start to drive operational efficiencies within their environment. So those are a really important part of thinking about modernization of your existing environment. And the cloud, of course, allows us to be able to do that in a much more effective way because of the fact that there are shared responsibility models associated with it. So in the case where you think about something like who can manage the cloud or the hardware infrastructure better, is going to be your own data center, or potentially Microsoft can do it more effectively because of the way that they can realize economies of scale. So there's an important concept there that you think about in terms of, do you want to hire the staff and maintain the equipment, et cetera, or do you want to take advantage of the fact that the cloud can do it more effectively, so long as you're very considerate of what are those additional costs and are you using the cloud effectively. So those are important considerations as we move forward. So one of the things, as I talked about sort of application estate, is we want to think about our legacy applications. And so we can look at these criteria. So if we think about what are some of the things that may impact us or that become top considerations for us, well, it's a difficulty and cost to operate, maintain, and enhance. So that's one of the things that I just talked about. Cost is going to always be an important consideration over time. And it's not just dollar costs necessarily. It can also be resource costs. Do you have to hire people in order to be able to take care of these particular applications? And then what is, and I'll get to a little of this, but it's what is the value proposition? So am I realizing value from keeping or maintaining those applications? The second point's another good one too on the left-hand side. So it's hard to find developers to be able to manage and maintain them, especially as we start getting into this concept of technology debt, or maybe even application environments that are no longer popular, or they're seeing end of life, but we're still maintaining them. And I know most people probably don't use COBOL, but it's a good example to really just talk about, well, I have existing mainframe COBOL applications that we're still running. Well, somehow you still have to take care of them. So that's an important part. And you may not be able to find developers that can do that. And then wanting to retire legacy applications and mainframe platforms, et cetera, that can be a big concern. So wanting to modernize, but not knowing how. That's an important consideration that a lot of execs really think about in terms of challenges. Unsupported technology vulnerabilities, we didn't really talk too much about security quite yet, but it also factors into this. So now you have, well, what happens now? Operating system vulnerabilities, for example, which can introduce security breaches, are things that you might want to consider as well. And who's managing and maintaining it? And I'll go back to the cloud architecture model again. Well, if you're thinking about operating system level patching and those kinds of activities, if you're using services that are managed by your cloud provider, like Microsoft Azure, they're going to take care of part of that for you. So the hardware vulnerabilities are being managed and maintained by the cloud provider. And depending on the cloud service model that you might be selecting, you have a different level of responsibility. If you want to manage the operating system, you can do that. If you want to use more platform as a service capabilities, then it's going to be managed for you. So this really has to do with how do you address any one of these particular areas of concern. And then it's also difficult to integrate with modern systems because of the technical debt that might be part of that, especially with legacy or unsupported applications. How do you integrate all of those systems together? And again, I'll use sort of that, the example of the mainframe. It's like, it may not support sort of classical API interfaces, for example. You'd have to create wrappers in order to be able to integrate with your modern systems. So that's another key consideration in terms of what to do. And then poor experience and usability concerns, because things evolve over time. So you think about, web applications, user experience considerations, and sort of the modern way that we think about applications. Those things will have changed over time. And unless you're keeping up with them, then you may be in a situation where you need to really think about, well, how can I start to sort of put a new face on my applications in order to make them more usable, and then help to drive a higher usability for your end user community. So all considerations, of course, and I kind of went into a low level of depth, but it really sets the stage for why is it that you would actually look at analyzing your application estate and then thinking about modernization, and more specifically modernization to the cloud. And it's not just modernization, because I also want to talk about innovation. So whether you have single applications or as I went through the list of business imperatives that you might think about as you're looking at your application estate, you might say, okay, well, maybe I have a handful of things that I want to do, or maybe there's a broader, maybe you want to address all of your enterprise applications. So it could be thousands of applications that you might be thinking about, but you can sort of classify the approach. And I'll talk about a framework for how to approach this. So it's not just, yeah, those are great ideas. We'll talk about very prescriptive models that we've used in order to be able to do this effectively, and then to give you a reasonable approach to be able to practically apply these concepts. So one thing that we take into consideration and that we've also done with customers is we start off by saying it's a journey. It's not a destination. So it's not we're gonna spend a year, we're gonna bang this all out, we're done. It's more of think about things in more of this this concept of using a journey, constant innovation of your environment. Sometimes we call this mechanical sympathy. Take advantage of new technologies as they may come out, or look at the existing infrastructure that you have and look for ways that you can improve it. So developing that kind of a culture within your organization helps you to be able to do this more effectively. It's also, as Jason was originally mentioning, the business imperatives start to drive this sort of concept of a catalyst, so that you can start to think about, well, how do I save money? How am I going to become more operationally efficient? How do I gain competitive advantage? Well, it starts to position us to be able to transform the business. And so those things can really help to drive these concepts. And what comes with it is sort of technology innovation to support the business imperative. And that's really important. So that's something that you should also take into consideration. And when we get into the playbook that I'll talk about, it really is, it's really an important part to think about what is the alignment to the business. Because as much as we might say we're technical people, we're architects, or we're developers, we don't really think too much about the business side of it. But guess what? At some point, we also need to pay for this. And so the paying part for it really takes into consideration, are you using the right technology that aligns to the business imperative? And then what is the cost profile of that? Because clearly, you can select the most expensive, the highest power environment that you possibly can select. And then maybe it's overkill, but it works. That's great. But you have to pay for it at the end of the day. And not everybody wants to pay for it, clearly. Most customers don't, because cost is always a factor. And then the last one here is it's also, it can be a point in time, of course, but we want to think about that culture of innovation. And it's an ongoing process. And so if you look at it from that perspective, then it doesn't become a matter of saying, okay, we're going to make this really big commitment. It's going to take us a year to modernize our entire application estate. But if you're looking at it as sort of an iterative process or constantly innovating, then it doesn't have to be that sort of, falling off a cliff or disruptive event within your organization. And that's really what we help customers to understand. So don't look at it as if it's sort of a decaying or a long-term technical debt building up that you have to eventually address. It's more of this culture of constantly innovating, constantly taking advantage of new technology as it occurs. And that's a really important concept to this as well. All right. So the first thing that we talked about was sort of aligning business goals and technology strategy. And so clearly, the two need to converge. And so if we think about what are the business goals ultimately, and we can make it as simple as possible, but simplicity from the business perspective, and I always like to talk about it in 2 or 3 ways. The two important ones are either competitive advantage or operational efficiency. And then there's also a third one that I like to talk about, which is basically, it's not necessarily competitive advantage, but it's keeping up with your competitors. So it's sort of innovation in the face of maybe losing ground to the leaders in the market. So you need to innovate in order to be able to do that. So those 3 things are really the business imperatives at a very high level. But in general, once those business goals have been defined, and clearly within the business context, there will be initiatives that are focused around this. And so once you understand what they are, then we can look at it and start to think about, well, how can we align technology to be able to support it? So You can then start to look at what are those mission critical applications, how to envision modernization ideas, or think about ways that you can apply services that may accommodate for some of the modernization that you're looking to do without having to create your own environment. Or you can also look at ways to lay a foundation to build up capabilities that allow you to be able to move into the modernization era to become more innovative or agile by increasing the knowledge and capabilities of your staff to be able to take advantage of these modern techniques that allow you to be able to create new applications that are leveraging the cloud or modern stack or platform techniques that allow you to be able to implement more effectively. So the other thing that is important is to balance these business factors with technology, and then define the actual problem statement. So this is sort of making it real. So how do you then say, okay, there's lots of really cool technology. Many of the cloud providers are introducing new services every day. Well, maybe not every day, every month, every quarter. But there is advances that are happening in the cloud provider space. So new services that are being introduced that help you to accomplish more, and they allow you to be able to do it faster. And it's also true even in the open source community. So new tools and technologies that are being created to make things simpler for the application developers of the world, or even for those that are managing existing applications. Things are becoming simpler for us over time. So taking advantage of that's really important. But because there's so much going on, you really do have to know what is that alignment to the business imperative. And so once you've done that, then you have a good ability to be able to then determine, this is my approach, this is how I'm going to move forward. Defining those goals, and Jason was talking about quantitative, qualitative. So if you can think of the business imperative overall, maybe as a qualitative goal, we want to improve competitive advantage, for example, we eventually want to turn that into quantitative goals. So how do we do that? How can we measure it? How do we know that we've actually been able to accomplish that particular qualitative goal? And that's where we really get into sort of making it real, or the rubber hits the road model. So we need to make sure that we understand how we're going to achieve success within those areas. Okay. So really the first step that we use is really assessment. So making sure that we understand what's the best migration strategy for the applications that you might have available today. So we really go through this assessment phase where it's collecting an inventory of what you have, understanding what the classification is of each one of the applications that you might be working with. And they could be packaged applications, or they could be custom applications, either or sort of fits into this model. And then once you've identified all of those applications, and there are plenty of tools out there that will help you to do this, to be able to identify which applications are running where do they live, which ports do they live on, how much resources do they currently consume, etc. But that assessment allows you to be able to sort of find everything and inventory all of those applications. Once you've been able to sort of inventory and understand all of your applications, you can then start to categorize or classify them into what parts of the business do they support. And then you can start to move into, well, once I've done that, now how can I align it to those business imperatives? How do I know that this set of applications, which maybe is focused more on, let's just say, your primary business is focused around maybe it's around something like retail sales, for example. And so retail sales happens through your web application. And so there's a series of applications that are associated with web sales. You can sort of collect those all together in terms of being your mission critical applications. Those mission critical applications then become the ones where you think about prioritization. And then you can perform an assessment on those to be able to understand, well, are they modernized? Can I take advantage of modernization of those? And can I achieve the business objective of competitive advantage or operational efficiency in the most effective way? So what are some of the things that you would do in order to make them more user-friendly, for example, or to increase sales? Or if it's operational efficiency, how do I lower the cost in terms of being able to operate each one of those call them web properties that you have available? So that you really get into this concept then of really looking at that application estate and then thinking about these areas. And in our case, I think we use 7 R's. I'll get to it in the next slide, I think. But in general, you look at each one of the applications by the categorizations that you would have created, and then you say, what am I going to do with this particular application in terms of weighing it against the business imperative? Am I going to retire the application, for example, which is a perfectly valid disposition for an application? And we talked earlier about, around half of the applications that are managed today by enterprises are rarely used. So at what point do you actually say it's okay to retire an application? That's a good cost saving strategy. And it's also a good way to think about what is it that you would do in order to be able to modernize your overall infrastructure. Maybe there are other applications that can do the things that those existing applications were doing, and you're going to retire them in order to be able to make it simpler for even your internal staff to be able to take advantage of these tools. Replacement's another concept where it's sort of maybe you can find a better or cheaper mechanism to be able to accomplish the same thing. You go through a replacement strategy or a rehosting. Rehosting is basically moving it from one environment to another. It likely is going to be cloud, but it could be maybe you rehosted it even on premise, for example. It really just depends on what value are you getting out of the rehosting activity. And so that's what you need to really think about. I mean, in most cases, the cloud is probably going to be the best target or disposition for your applications because of the fact that you might want to take advantage of managed services that allow you to be able to do more without having to worry about the management of the technical infrastructure. So those might be good candidates for rehosting activities, but it doesn't always have to be that way. So you really need to think about what are those sort of rehosting activities that you would want to take advantage of, and then what's the cost profile, business imperative profile that would be associated with it. But also take into consideration things like, do you have the staff in order to be able to manage and maintain this? Or are they managed services, in which case it becomes simpler for you to be able to deploy into the environment, but then be able to focus your precious internal resources on just sort of focusing on making things more effective for the organization, and not so much focusing on managing and maintaining the technical debt that might be associated with the existing application. So the next one is really just talking about refactoring. So it might be, the applications might be okay. They might be, maybe they do what they are expected to do, but you might want to do some slight refactoring, which is associated with the application. Maybe I'm going to swap out the underlying database, for example, so I can refactor the database support. Maybe I'm going to move from a sort of a relational database to a NoSQL database in order to be able to improve the speed for the application, but the application actually still runs using maybe a LAMP stack or whatever stack you might be using, .NET application, etc. And maybe it's good the way it is. So you're saying, I'm just going to do some refactoring of the application to make it more effective and to modernize components of it to allow us to be able to, make it more efficient, or maybe improve the user experience because now my SLA for performance gets better. And then re-architecting is really just a matter of saying the concept of the application is great, but the technologies that we use to implement it or the approach that we might have used is not necessarily meeting the expectations. So I might want to say, keep the concept of what it's doing, but sort of re-architect it. And so really look at how can I re-architect that so that maybe it's using better, newer technologies, more efficient technologies, different capabilities in the general sense. And so it's really just looking at it from the perspective of a re-architecture might give you better performance, or as I was talking about before, it's sort of taking refactoring to the next level where I might say, well, there are managed services that can accomplish some of this for me. And then really all I have to do is focus on just sort of creating or using the existing code I have, but using a different architectural approach in order to be able to look at things in a more effective way, and then also to improve the experience if that's the ultimate goal. And then the final one is really re-envisioning. So it's sort of let's go back to ground zero. So if the application estate or collection of applications that we might have created, they really don't address the overall business imperative, then we might want to say, well, we're going to re-envision this. So we're going to start really from first principles, if you will. Let's understand the wants and needs of our users. And then let's really just look at it from the perspective of, well, how would I do this if I were to start from scratch? what are the requirements that I would want to look at, and then how can I re-envision this, leveraging the new technologies or modernized technologies that I have available to me, and then really look at the art of the possible. And so if you think about an entire application estate, you can look at this and say, okay, well, I've probably you're going to get some kind of a distribution across your entire application estate. And so what we've seen, and these are just statistics based on our own experiences, is that we end up with sort of, distributions similar to this. And so it's not always the case. Your mileage may vary depending on what you might be looking at, but in general, you can see this kind of a distribution. So usually rehost, refactor, re-architect are kind of the areas that we typically would focus in. So about, roughly 45% of what you might see falls into these categories. And it's not so much that it's necessarily the case that those are more important than others, but clearly you're going to get the most benefit out of those kinds of investments that you make. And that's really what we want to focus on too, making sure that you're putting your valuable resources into the kinds of things or initiatives that are most important to you in order to be able to take advantage of that operational efficiency or competitive advantage, as we talked about. And then we've also seen that while we all love to recreate things, re-envisioning isn't something where most times organizations, especially at the enterprise level, they're already in the process of, we know what we want to do, we know where we want to go, and we've probably evolved our applications to be able to support a lot of what we do. So when you think about re-envisioning, those are usually situations where they're not as common, but you still do want to say, well, maybe we should go back to the drawing board and really sort of focus on these sort of highly impactful applications that can help to drive, like I said, better experience, et cetera. So that's really, this distribution I think is important to note, because it sort of helps you to identify, where do I focus? And then you can see, as you go through the process, you can start to identify, well, these are the items where I should be focusing, and the distribution would be common, or at least similar, so that you can say, am I on the right track here? Or if you end up with the majority of your estate sort of saying, well, we need to re-envision it, that's really telling about what it is that you might be looking at. So if, for example, none of the apps really hold muster in terms of helping you to understand or realize the business imperative, then you may want to actually think a little bit about, well, how do we kind of go back to the drawing board and do it in an effective way? And that sort of gets us to this prioritization and mapping. So now we can say, once we understand all that, and we've sort of created this cross section of understanding business imperative, understanding the ultimate disposition of our applications, now we can go back to this concept of, well, we're not going to boil the ocean all at once. So we're not going to say, okay, great, put those 300 applications or 1,000 applications onto a project roadmap, and we're going to do this all in the next 6 months. Well, that's not going to happen, because most organizations, number one, they have to manage their existing infrastructure and application estate, even as it is. So you're not going to be able to bring on the resources or take your existing resources and just go. So eventually, or what we really come down to is, we sort of start this iterative model. So first wave of applications, we pick some distribution of the kinds of dispositions that we're looking to achieve. And then we really sort of focus on, let's go through a sort of an initial iteration. The initial iteration allows us to be able to understand how to modernize those applications within the context of what it is that we look to achieve, understand the business imperatives better, but also it helps us to understand what kinds of skills and capabilities do we need in order to create a development environment that is modernized. So because it's not just technology application, it's also the way that your application developers and your resources internally know how to create, manage, and maintain your infrastructure in order to create these applications. So there's a lot of learning that comes in that first wave, if you will. So it helps you to understand what is required of us, what do we have, what are the gaps that we might have in our resources, and then we can start to think about, well, how do we fill those gaps? Do you bring on external partners to help you with some of these things? Does it help you to focus more on, maybe I want to use PaaS services so that I'm not spending a lot of time focusing on support of my environment? So you can start to get a good feel for, well, what's the best pattern for us within the organization, and then you can apply those to the next set of waves that you would create. And then the other thing that's important to note here is that we are also looking at it from the perspective of we can start to scale. So once we understand sort of the general philosophy of how we're going through this modernization, we can now, through each wave, we can take those learnings and apply them to the next wave. And it allows us to be able to do this now at scale. So in many cases, we might say, maybe the majority of these are refactoring or rehosting. Well, we might say that the general pattern for rehosting is X. We create a landing zone, we migrate the application, maybe we do some light replacement on a refactoring of the underlying database, we can migrate the databases. We can do that at scale. So maybe we take all of the applications that have existing databases, we change their connections to a managed services database, and then now we can actually do that at scale. So you can start to move very fast then. But in the initial stages, you still are bumping into some of the questions of, well, are the databases too complex, or is is changing out the connectivity to the database, if that's the refactoring we might be doing, does that cause complications? Or it may be even if it's just a simple refactoring, how do I know that it works? Do I have enough test capacity, or have I built in testing automation that allows them to be able to do that effectively so that I know when I actually rehost, it's going to work? So those are really important considerations as you think about sort of growing into this. And this is a common strategy that we use all the time because, I can't even think of too many organizations at this point that said, nope, we're doing it all tomorrow. Let's just get on the project plan. That just doesn't happen. So we usually start small, call the first wave an MVP, but in general, you're just sort of practicing how are you going to do this overall. Okay, so now even getting deeper into this, if you're planning for execution, so this really just helps to identify what are the set of steps that you would use. And remember before I was talking about, it's really nice to know that generally we want to accomplish these things, but if you don't have a playbook, if you don't really understand what the approach is, then you're going to have to figure it out as you go. And so what we've done is we've created frameworks that allow us to be able to talk about, well, if we identify through assessment the actual disposition of the applications as part of our modernization, now we can actually think about, okay, well, if it's something like a retirement, for example, who are the users that are impacted, communicate the end of life event, shut down the servers. And of course, it's a little more complicated than that. But in general, those are the things that we want to do. And we've got, an entire playbook, which is associated with, well, what really happens during all of those phases. But the general philosophy is that you want to accomplish these steps. And then notice something like, we'll go to the extreme, like a re-envisioning. So once we've done the alignment, we start the envisioning process. We do detailed designs. We develop and stabilize, maybe an MVP, and then we start to look for release, collect feedback, and then go through iterative cycles in order to be able to understand how is it that you would re-envision an application or a set of applications to achieve a business imperative or business goal. And so these really just helps you to understand, based on the ultimate target for each one of the applications or sets of applications, what are the set of steps that you would apply so that you actually can figure out how to implement this. Because ultimately you're going to want to understand, well, how much is it going to take? How much is it going to cost me? How much time do I need? How many resources do I need? Those are the practical sets of accomplishing this kind of a modernization. So those are all really important to understand. And it also helps to make it practical. Okay. So the other part of it is that it's important to understand what resources do you have, which resources do you need, and then how can you actually accomplish this within a specific time period that you might have set for yourselves. Like you might have imperatives to accomplish this within the course of the next year, within the course of the next quarter, etc. And so it's important to be able to not reinvent the wheel on your own, but it's partnering together to understand, somebody who's gone through this process already, and then be able to help you understand how to do it as a partner, so that it's sort of how do you go through this operationalization phase? How do you train and adopt within the new environment? And I really kind of passed over this concept of really change management within the organization. So some of the different approaches, or when we think about what is the target or disposition of the applications, it may require change management within your own environment in order to be able to understand, well, what happened to those applications? What are we doing now? Or even change management as it relates to maybe different philosophies in terms of how we go through our implementation processes. Maybe we do something like, maybe we're moving from sort of classic IaaS to maybe we're going to go with more containerization, for example, or even, PaaS services. That changes our design development philosophy. So those may be things, especially for large organizations, that you want to make sure that you understand, and then you can communicate effectively to the broader organization that this is our new philosophy, this is how we plan on moving forward, et cetera. So it's not just a matter of saying, tomorrow we're using Kubernetes, everybody have a nice day, let's go. It takes a little bit longer than that in order for the organizational learning process to take place. And then the other thing that I talked about in the beginning was really just continuing to innovate. Sometimes organizations really think about this as, I need to modernize my estate, I'm going to do that, I'm going to be done next year, and then we're going to move on. Well, it's kind of like buying a car. The minute you drive off the lot, it starts to depreciate. So you also have to think about, well, how am I going to manage and maintain it in order to sort of preserve the value of that car, if you will, as you drove off the lot. And a car is not the greatest example, but you get the initial example. The idea is you want to continue to innovate. So basically, you want to create a culture of innovation where you're not going to allow this sort of technical debt to creep into your environment, where over time, technical debt becomes so great that it's really becoming costly, or it can block your ability to be able to stay innovative within the organization. So that really needs to be sort of the essence of what it is that you're looking to do. And while it doesn't need to be your primary imperative, it should be an imperative that you think about. So you're thinking about, how do you understand how to become an innovative organization, or to be able to apply and these concepts that we're going through during modernization, but it now just becomes part of the status quo as you look at the future. Okay. So there are some misconceptions I think that we also want to think about. So I've kind of laid out this plan and strategy for how you would do this, and a framework for an approach, which can help you to really understand, where do I start? And so frameworks really are great at allowing you to be able to say, well, I don't know where to start. I know I need to modernize. I know I need to move to the cloud, or I know I need to really take advantage of, additional services because I don't have the resources. But the framework gives you some place to start. You can start to collect your thinking around what it is that you want to accomplish. And then the guidelines that we help you with really allow you to be able to put it down in a plan, and then you can execute the plan. So that's really the idea. So the key here is one of the things is that's important, I already mentioned this, is you have to have a strategy. Modernizing is not just porting. So we talked about the different variations or different dispositions. So not everything is just ported over. That was one of the early days in terms of cloud adoption. What happened was that people just took their entire application estate that was running within their data centers, and they moved it all over, and they said, okay, that's great, now what do we do? But they didn't actually modernize anything. So then all of a sudden, after a while, they looked at it and said, okay, we saved a little bit of money, but now all of a sudden, our applications aren't doing what we expect them to do. We really should have thought about maybe the ones that we don't use, which was the stat I gave earlier. Maybe we should have not moved them, or maybe we should have figured out how to refactor them so we could do other things with them. So that's important. So it's not just porting. So basically, migration's usually a good start, but it's not the end game. And I talked about innovation and making sure that you have sort of this culture of innovation within the organization, and that's really important. And the other thing that's important is, ad hoc's not a great approach. Why? Because ad hoc can be, normally what happens is sort of like, you're playing a little bit of whack-a-mole, if you know that game. But basically what happens is that applications that fail or applications that need attention raise in terms of priority because they may not be working. And so you're dealing with issues as they occur. Well, then now you're in an event-driven approach, and you're only dealing with problems. You're not really taking a strategic approach to understanding what's the highest business value. You're really just responding to issues as they occur. That's not a great approach. So we talked about strategy in the first area, but let's talk about it a little bit more. So you want to think strategically, understand the plan, understand the roadmap, but act tactically, have an approach. And that's really what we really want to think about. And also, I talked about a strategy for not boiling the ocean. You start with a multi-wave strategy. You start with wave one, you learn, you apply that. It's like reinforcement learning in the AI space. You want to learn from what you've done in the first wave, apply the learning to the second wave. And then you should hopefully, by the time you hit the third wave and beyond, you should be at the point where now you can scale. You have a good understanding of what it is that you wanted to achieve. And then you can also test, was the TCO that you expected, has it been validated? So the total cost of ownership that you expected, does that pan out? Are you saving money where you expect to? Is there a good ROI with respect to how you look at this? And then the last one is also think about, like, it's okay to learn in the beginning. So don't think that you have have it all down. And even though we've done this hundreds of times, I would not say that we have all the answers. So even though you've done it many, many times before, or you're working with a partner that may have done it before, it's not always going to be just a rote, here you go, here are the steps, you execute them and everybody's happy. You will learn along the way. Every application estate is different because you use different techniques and technologies, and the expectation for what they can do is always different. So make sure that you understand what your particular perspective might be on it as an organization, and then also understand where there might be gaps. And so learning is a key part of this as you go. And that's really the idea of this sort of think strategically, act tactically model. Let's enforce the learning process. Let's learn from mistakes, because it's okay to have setbacks in the early waves so that you can say, well, we didn't think about these particular problems, or there was a particular type of coding process that we use that maybe doesn't work anymore, or maybe we missed a few things when we were doing the assessment. All of that's okay. So we learn along the way, but we've also, and the benefit of that is that we didn't commit all of our resources to be able to do it. We didn't actually, we're not trying to boil the ocean. So learning is encouraged, learning is expected, and it's part of the process. And so just make sure that you afford yourself the luxury of learning as you go, because don't expect that it's really just a process that you follow that's so deterministic that all you have to do is turn the crank. It's not going to be that way when you start. And so working with a partner can help you to guide the way, and then to provide that sort of guidance for how to deal with things that maybe aren't aligned to the expectations that you might have started with, and to get it right as you go. Okay. And then if you think about, so again, this is really just sort of our experience in the area. So we've worked closely with Microsoft. We've done a lot of these kinds of activities. We've done lots and lots of migrations. We've done rehosting. We've done re-envisioning. So we've applied this framework within this context. And so, you can see the accolades here. I'm not going to read them all to you, but in general, it's like we've done a lot in the platform. So if you're looking to sort of go through the process as it relates to migrating to the cloud, or even looking at your application estate and modernizing in the cloud, we can definitely help you there. And so we allow you to be able to look at that, perform the assessments, and understand what are some of the features and benefits that in partnering with Microsoft might be available to you. So in many ways, Microsoft is interested in helping to enable the adoption of the cloud to take advantage of these key capabilities that I've been talking about. And so they will help to incentivize the process overall. So that is something that you can take advantage of, and something you can work with us to be able to help to promote. The other thing is that, again, I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but in general, when you look at Insight, our primary areas of focus are going to be around these key areas in the upper right. So we basically, we focus in on things like data and AI in the context of Azure. So in any application estate, even an application is a data-driven application. So certainly many things, and I think Jason mentioned this in the beginning of the conversation, ChatGPT, everybody wants to talk about how to use it. How do I integrate AI into my application estate? How do I make smarter applications? Or even how do I code better by using something like, Copilot in order to be able to say, well, how do I make my coding more efficient, et cetera? So we can certainly help in that context. How do you apply these techniques to your application creation or the way that you innovate within the organization? So these are areas where we can help to engage with you. We engage with Microsoft all the time. We're gold partners. We've been doing lots of work with them, or partners of the year in many ways. And so we can help you to really just understand, how do you take advantage of the services, features, capabilities of the Azure platform in order to drive this forward. Certainly digital and app innovation, which is primarily what I was talking about today, the infrastructure within Azure. Jason was talking about that earlier. Even in the context of sort of overall adoption and innovation, even using modern work platforms, modern workspace, making sure that you understand how to engage. And of course, security built in is really super critical when you think about anything that we would do. How do you build security into the overall infrastructure? And clearly, and I didn't talk about it too much, but as we think about how do you modernize your application estate, how do you modernize your approach, security needs to be part of that approach. And clearly, it is front and center. If you read about security these days, cybersecurity is something that's talked about quite frequently, maybe overshadowed a little bit by this whole generative AI thing. But in general, security is super important to many organizations. All organizations, I should say. And then clearly business apps. So, again, taking advantage of software as a service applications, or applications that can help you to become more operationally efficient or do more with capabilities that are built for you. And that's really just sort of looking at, well, how can I take advantage of the different services or business applications that are available to me, even things like Dynamics, for example, for CRM, et cetera. And then in the grand scheme, and I highlighted a few of the specializations that are probably most relevant to this conversation, but basically it's on the data side, Windows Server, SQL Server, et cetera. Migration to Azure is a key area of ours. Kubernetes, as you think about microservices and being able to do container deployments, orchestration and management. Modernization, of course, of web applications is key. That's a part of the playbook that I was describing. And then adoption and change management, threat protection, et cetera. So those are all really key areas, because it's not just technology, it's also how do you sort of deal with or infuse change management into your overall environment. Okay, so I've talked quite a bit. I wanted to open it for a few minutes to maybe some questions, and then I'll wrap up with what's coming. So we have a series of these conversations as well, but maybe we can take a few questions before we run out of time, and I'll wrap up with just the webinars that are upcoming in this series. And I can't see the chat window, so let me see if there's any questions that might have come up. So let's see. Jason, I don't know if you've been following the questions. Any questions that you can see that might have come up that we want to take, or?
Yeah, so the first question I see in there is, which functions should I automate in the cloud, and how do I determine which applications to move to the cloud?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I think and I wish I could give you just one answer for that, but the answer would be really looking at that framework approach or the assessment approach, understanding what the applications do today, understanding what the what the business imperatives are in terms of how do you want to realize benefit? And so if the benefit is, and let's just say migration to the cloud, because you asked that question, is it migration to the cloud in order to be able to, say, lower the cost of maintenance of the application? And if that's the case, then we can do that analysis. It's relatively easy to say, well, if you moved it to the cloud, you can save X amount of dollars, for example. It's a pretty simple ROI from that perspective. If it's something that might be focused on improving user experience, and maybe user experience is improved by lowering the SLA, then I might say, okay, well, now we can look at it and say, which services within the cloud might be better? Maybe it's using, database as a service. Maybe it's using other functions as a service that can help us to be able to create a better experience for your end user by lowering the response times, or giving you more predictable response times, or even increasing the availability of the application. So there are many ways to actually go through this. And so if you sort of think about the business imperative first, and then you start to look at, okay, well, how can the cloud help me? Then I think that will allow you to be able to identify which are the most logical ones that you would probably move to the cloud.
Right. Yeah. So the other question that came in was, does Insight allow customers to test and evaluate cloud platform components? And I'll jump into this one just real quick.
Sure.
And I'll take it from an Azure perspective, right? So the power of cloud, right, is the ability to not have to build everything at once, right? You can build these small, proof of concept type of things and shut them down, right, without having to expend all kinds of resources. The other thing is there's always investment opportunities from the partners. So, for example, Microsoft, if it's the right opportunity, you might have an opportunity to get some funding for projects or things like that, depending on what you're building. And so, really, the key to that, in my opinion, the key to answer that question is you're probably not going to get any quote free resources from the cloud. But having a strategy and a plan up front about what I'm going to migrate, how I'm going to test and build a proof of concept around the things that I'm trying to build out, and having a partner that can help you lead that conversation forward in a way that makes sense for your business strategically is really one of the biggest values, in my opinion, Insight provides. Carm, I don't know if you have anything else to add on that.
No, that's great. Yeah, and I was just going to say that there are many programs that certainly Microsoft has, which helps you to basically dip your toe in, if you will. So they really just sort of help you with incentivizing. These are the kinds of workloads that you might want to move, and the funding is available to help you to be able to do that more effectively. And so I think that there are many programs which can help you to sort of get, like you said, there are no free resources necessarily, but it's more of the, let's commit to talking about what it is that you would do. And then those incentives are provided by Microsoft along with Insight in order to be able to help you along to sort of reduce the cost of really looking at how this might impact your business. That's a good question.
Thanks. Yeah. So the other question that just came in is, what should be my account and subscription strategy? And I'll take that at first. So anytime you're talking about account and subscriptions strategy, what I'm really hearing in my head is, how do I apply FinOps to my organization? Like that's the question I hear in the back of my mind, because the strategy you use to deploy resources in your environment should be kind of the same regardless of how you're setting that up. You need to have a plan in front of it, a governance model. And in many cases, this is, again, where Insight can help, having a partner to help you kind of lead that conversation. Because what I hear underlying in that conversation is, hey, how do I make sure that I don't run into cost overruns? How do I make sure I'm deploying the right resources? So it's the question behind the question. Carm, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I think that was great. And let me just wrap up because I want to be sensitive to time. And if there are additional questions, you certainly, if you wanted to reach out to us, you can feel free to do that. But I just wanted to introduce the series, the rest of the series. So part 2, we'll talk about optimizing your Microsoft Cloud investment. That's on June 7th, managing the cloud for growth and innovation. And a lot of these are related, by the way. On July 19th, maximizing your app innovation quotient on August 30th, and then maximize data intelligence on October 11th, and then maximizing cloud security. So we'd certainly love to see you back for those as well. And we'll continue to dive into these topic areas and to hopefully, educate you on the best approaches that you can use over time. And then we really love your questions, and thank you all for attending. And Jason, thank you for the conversation today. Really appreciate everybody joining.
Yeah, thank you, Carm.